Hello and welcome to episode 16 of Breaking, Building, and Belonging. The voices we follow matter. It's a memoir-driven podcast, and we are at the point in time where I'm going to introduce my father. In our last episode 15, we talked about my grandfather. He's also known as Peepop. And in this episode, we're going to talk about my dad, my real father, even though in many ways Peepop was the closest thing I had to a dad growing up. I did get to get reacquainted with my dad a little bit later in my teen years, and I'd like to share that story with you now. So this this chapter's called Building, Dipsticks, Dads, and DJs. It starts out with a quote. We're in such a hurry most of the time, we never get much chance to talk. The result is a kind of endless, day-to-day shallowness, a monotony that leaves a person wondering years later where all the time went, and sorry that it's all gone. Robert Pirsig, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. One Sunday we were sitting at Graham and Peepop's lamenting some lack of something, shoes, clothes, food. I don't know what it was. It may very well have been being bored over the summer. And I seem to remember Graham getting up frustrated, explaining something like, in Italian, Brooklynese half curse, she often shouted out in times of frustration, Angora! We all knew what that meant. This has gone on too long. Enough already. Enough. She got up and called on one of those old wall phones. You know, the ones with the long twisty cord that seem to only come in canary yellow, lime green, or maroon. She called her waspy counterpart, my dad's mom. These women hadn't spoken for 10 years, and I have no idea how Graham still had her number. Rather than an antagonistic phone call, one that, we might have all expected after those many years of hearing how awful my dad and his kin were for abandoning us, I recall somewhere through the cobwebs of time that they almost had like a jovial reconnection. In this conversation, Graham turned on that trademark laundry room sidewalk charm, and my grandmother in New York shared the same name as my sister. The one who survived those beings with the statue. A coincidence I always hope was only formed in my imagination. So DJ Johnson, my gram called, and she was the wife of Alvin Johnson, the mother of 3 sons. My dad was the middle child. My uncle Alvin, Ken, my dad, and my uncle Dan. DJ was the family's matriarch and played a solid starring role just like Graham did on my mom's side. So Graham and DJ, they talked on the phone for a few minutes, and before I knew it, I was talking to my Grandma Johnson. She soon arranged for my Uncle Alvin, who was the most prosperous Johnson, to send us a couple of airline tickets. Well, my youngest sister, Angelina, and I were chosen to go on what we thought would be the first visit, where my sisters and I would get reacquainted with our estranged dad and his family. That meeting and trip to New York was great for me. I met my cousin Eric. We hung out with my youngest Uncle Dan, my grandparents, and my dad. But unlike me, my sister's trip was a bit of a disaster. She did not enjoy herself and was not feeling physically or mentally well during the visit. She did not connect with the family as I did, and she was incredibly homesick. After we returned home, she vowed never to return and never did. That, however, was not my destiny, and I'm pretty thankful about that. As you'll hear in subsequent chapters, I returned to New York and spent a few more summers with the Johnson family and my aunts and uncles, Nico side, as we're saying in this podcast. Between summers, I talked to the Johnsons via collect phone calls to my grandma a few times a month. The way we would do that back then is that they had kind of a little quirk in the system, and you could say you were disconnected. So sometimes I'd put on like a little accent and I'd say, "Hello, operator. I've been disconnected. Could you please connect me to Dorothy Johnson?" And then they would typically connect. Or sometimes I'd like do a legit collect phone call and call and ask for my grandmother accept the charges, which she did. So I'd make those collect phone calls a few times a month, but I spoke to my dad a lot less often. In the early years of reconciliation, I'm not sure I even had his direct phone number. This was way before cell phones. But I did occasionally call here or there, caught him having dinner at my grandma's. You know, they had no way of contacting us. We didn't have a phone most of the time, and we either had to use Grams or that payphone where I made those collect calls. As I grew closer to my Grandma Johnson, I asked many questions about my dad, and I learned much more about him from her than I did directly from him. I knew that he had a girlfriend before Veronica, his wife, my stepmom, with whom he had lived for a while, and that he was close to Veronica's kids. I learned that he was always shy and sensitive. Grandma Johnson alleged that Dad talked about us often with her and missed us dearly, wanting to visit us, but fearing that he would be unwelcome to do so. So at first, my conversations with my dad were stiff and surface level, and Sergeant Stu Nod was always there whispering, "See, he doesn't even ask about you. He doesn't care." And then Graham's voice wasn't far behind, her sharp bastardo ringing in my ears, a word she wielded like a verdict. But as I listened more to Grandma Johnson, the Colonel helped me hear something else. Regret. Uncertainty. A man who didn't know how to fix what he had broken. The truth, well, it wasn't black and white. It never is. So I could glean a bit of this firsthand from my dad as well. Like many dads and dudes back then, he wasn't a great conversationalist, especially about anything relational or emotional. At first, many of our conversations were surface level about school, his work, his Harley hobby. After I met Veronica, we would most often talk about her and the kids and how things were going with them. I'd fill him in on whatever drama was unfolding in my life at that time. Later, as I became a dad myself, we started to go a little deeper. But at that time, his health was beginning to fail, and he was having trouble staying awake long enough for a conversation. If you took a snapshot of my dad and me at the same age, at any point in our lives, there might be very little chance of you seeing carbon copies on the surface. My dad was a working man. He was a Navy veteran. My dad often sported a beard, a full beard, to hide his baby face, and I still struggle to grow facial hair beyond the faintest of mustaches, and I did that well into my 30s. Now I have like a little scruffy gray beard. My dad worked with his hands most of his life until obesity and oxygen depriving untreated sleep apnea took that away. He was a mechanic, a tool and die man, a Harley riding, carburetor fixing enthusiast of those machines. He was quiet and shy around strangers, but he was boisterous and bold around family. Much larger than life in more than just a literal sense. His fate was to become too heavy and tired to live beyond his 50s. He was morbidly obese at the end of his life. In a twist of irony, my dad loved roller coasters, tiny confined trains with restraints made only for average-sized humans. I have this one fantastic memory from one of my solo junkets to New York when he was closer to my current weight. I fit snugly into most amusement rides these days, but I still always panic just a little because they're not really designed for me. And that countdown to launch winds down, it gets me kind of nervous. But that summer, I may have been 16. We took a trip to an amusement park and rode snake-like intertwined coasters that I was sure could not hold either one of us. In those times, he had a childlike joy that I'm sorry my sisters never had a chance to see, because they truly never really reconnected with him after our estrangement. Well, my sister spent time with him only 2 times, and both were quite limited. One was when he made it down for my wedding. Although that was quite fleeting, he mostly hung out with Peepop, my groomsman at the time, if I remember right. Another time was when he visited shortly before he died, when my youngest was still in diapers. When he visited that time, the years of regret came to the surface as my sisters recounted tales of what it was like growing up without resources, and he teared up between bouts of apnea-induced narcolepsy to share with us how he felt about what we were telling him. He said, "I thought you all were okay. I thought Dom and Josephine were taking care of you guys. I didn't know it was that tough." While I agree that my dad could have initiated getting back in touch with us sooner than my 14th year of life, after leaving when I was 6 and my sisters were 3, I get why he didn't. He possessed neither the resilience nor the chit that I describe my D'Amico grandparents as having. He could not withstand the chaos that followed my family around like the dust cloud that followed Pigpen of Peanut Comics fame. I don't know what he was like when he was younger and still married to my mom. I know that we had our own house for a few years, but my mom did not love living there. For many years, we lived in my grandparents' basement. My memories are fleeting. In my mind, I have a couple of snapshots. One is my dad watching either TV or a movie. Maybe it's like Godzilla versus Kong, watching that on a projector screen. And another is a glimpse of him riding his Harley around our block. I'm not sure if those are real or imagined memories at this point. I know of one actual image, a moment caught on film, too far back for a real memory, as I was probably between 1 and 2 years old. It's that same 8mm film that I talked about earlier in the memoir, with my mom playing with me. It shows my dad in a white t-shirt, his poorly drawn Navy era leopard tattoo, or panther, I don't know what it is, like Black Panther, exposed on his arms as he lifts me up, puts me on his shoulders. There's a joy that both of them show in that movie that does not seem to have been contrived for the antiquated motion picture camera of the early 1970s. I do know that I saw a similar joy when he rode coasters with me or straddled his bike. I had a chance to ride with him briefly as a teenager through the rolling hills of upstate New York. There was a smile, and there was that joy from the old film. He had a pretty biting sense of humor as well. He could be shy and quiet at times, but in his comfort zone, around family and close friends, that humor would pierce through any sadness or regret. And you'd fall for him, even as he was giving you crap. You could see that he loved his mom and brothers and his dad. You could see how he teased them. He loved my stepmother, Veronica, and her kids as well. When I visited New York solo and once with my ex-wife, I was only a teenager, but my stepbrother and sister were in elementary school. My dad's new crew lived in a small house, one big enough for everyone to have their own room. Most of the time, I stayed at my grandma's, which had plenty of space, with no one else living there. But when I stayed the night at my dad's, I slept on the lazy boy recliner in the living room. Dad's love of movies was still strong, and I would pop in videotapes, and watch movies while everyone else slept. My step siblings were shy, but seemed okay to make room for a stepbrother in their lives for just a brief stint here and there. Unfortunately, I never grew close to my stepmom, stepbrother, or stepsister. I felt that was a true shame, as they're good people, and they took good care of my dad and loved him dearly while he was alive. I'll never forget the time, years after my father passed away, when I received a photo album Veronica lovely crafted for my sisters and me. She filled it with pictures of my dad and those pictures of my sisters and myself and our families that my dad had received from us over in the mail and kept over the years. It also contains images of his Navy discharge, pictures of my dad as a little kid. She cherished these photos and memories, yet she sent them to us. Kids she never truly got to know, but probably always felt the bond through as she walked with Dad through the struggle of our estrangement. The album has little captions to retell and pay tribute to his story. In the letter accompanying the album, Veronica said, "Your dad had pictures of you kids on his tool bench. He thought of you often and loved you all very much." So after being told he was a bastard and a deadbeat for most of my childhood, I grew to love the man my mother told me was responsible for every predicament our impoverished family endured. It was beaten into my sisters and me that my dad was Dr. Evil and my mom was Austin Powers, trying to save us from certain doom. I wasn't aware of this in elementary school, but I had a class with the daughter of my dad's live-in girlfriend before Veronica. My grandma told me that that girl knew who I was, and still I wasn't permitted to know who she was, and that young lady came home crying one day because during a class exercise describing our dad's jobs, I had announced to the class that my dad didn't have a job. He was in jail, and disparagingly described him to the class as my mother often described him. None of that was true, of course. Such vitriol among divorced couples is not uncommon today. Still, the late 1970s and early 1980s seemed like a fertile ground for the sour grapes of failed marriages and estranged dads and husbands to be ostracized on an entirely different level. Ultimately, I conclude that there were no clear heroes or villains in this short saga, which was their marriage. Did he bear equal responsibility for taking care of us, especially financially? Did he do so? No. Did he regret that later? Yes. Would that have been possible if he had had all the money in the world to throw our direction? I somehow doubt it. So, irresponsible toward us kids, yes. Evil, no. The court, it ordered him to pay a small amount of money in child support based on his income, likely imputed at an unemployment rate of near zero, and my mom's that of a typical unemployed welfare mom of the 80s. As someone who worked in child support enforcement as my first job out of college, I could tell you that scenario was not uncommon. So how do I know he would not have been able to make our lives better by sending more money our way? After the reconciliation, my dad or uncle sometimes sent us money for a bike or other presents for Christmas, but it would quickly be used for food, electricity, or gas for the car. So what happened was they stopped sending money. It would go something like this. "Hey John, how's your new bike we bought you?" "Well, Dad, we had to pawn it." "What?" Yeah, we needed the money for the electric bill." So post-reconciliation, the occasional money for gifts stopped flowing after a few conversations like that. Also, the way the welfare system at the time was set up, the more money you made, the less you received in food stamps. So my mother's taking on a job usually just meant fewer food stamps or an increase in our subsidized rent. The only ones who seemed to do just a little better were the moms who had a live-in boyfriend that they didn't report to the welfare authorities. These kids seemed to keep their new bikes every Christmas, and their cars were just a bit nicer than ours because they were never in the mom's name. That came with another price, though. Those guys could come and go as they pleased and take their food money and their nicer rides with them. For the most part, my mom avoided that particular roller coaster by never replacing Dad with a live-in substitute. She kept any guys out of the house who could have harmed me or potentially much worse, my sisters. And I'm grateful for that. Another thing I acquired from my dad after his passing was his grunge vanity motorcycle license plates. I am unsure if this was his nickname, but they remind me of him, so I keep them in my office. When I glance at those artifacts, I don't think much about the time we lost or the drama. I don't resent the lost years or the massive vacuum of knowledge I lack about what he was indeed like. It's a shame that my kids never met their grandfather in any memorable way, honestly, and that my sisters never got to see him in his prime and get to know him a bit more, like the sweet, caring man that I got to know. They instead have a memory of a book-ended caricature. The deadbeat dad who rejected us and left us to go hungry on one end, the obese man who would spontaneously fall asleep as you spoke with him on the other. But I wish they had sat in a diner with him as I had, heard him laugh and joke with his family, or seen him riding a roller coaster or polishing his motorcycle. They would have what I have if that were the case. They'd have a memory of a man who was not simply the sum of his worst moments, the victim of a tragic end, but a complex man with a good heart and a loving disposition, with a set of family and friends who truly loved him and thought the world of him, despite his all too human imperfections. You know, Dad liked to play, and he enjoyed his toys. He had friends, cousins, people who rode alongside him through good and bad times. That kind of connection, I realize now, is essential to every human life. Maybe that's why I gravitated toward my own circle of friends early on, before I ever even reconnected with my dad. I had my own people, Kip and the others, who in their own way taught me the same lessons about loyalty, laughter, and the joy of the ride. I'm going to talk about them in the next episode. Thanks for joining me. The book should come out in the summer. Thanks for listening, and if you have any input, any feedback, let me know. This is all an editing process. Be well. I want to see you soar.